The morning she pulled up with the first load, it was a Tuesday, late June of 1987, and the air had that particular weight to it that comes just after a storm has used itself up and left everything green and dripping and smelling of copper and wet bark. I was 11 years old and standing at the fence post nearest the road, the way you do when you're 11, and something unusual is coming up the drive. And I watched my grandmother ease that old flatbed down the lane with the bed stacked 4 feet high in wooden lug boxes, each one filled with peaches that had no business being beautiful, and were not, strictly speaking, beautiful at all. They were bruised along one cheek where the hail had found them 2 days prior, dimpled and soft in places, weeping a little at the damaged skin the way a ripe peach will when the cell walls give and the juice has nowhere left to go. 900 pounds of them, more or less. She had paid the Alderman family $6 for the lot, which by the count of the lug boxes worked out to somewhere between 1 and 2 cents a pound, and they had been glad to be rid of them because a bruised peach cannot be crated and shipped without turning the whole crate to mush inside of 48 hours, and the aldermans had a contract to fill and no time for anything that would not travel clean. My grandmother's name was Cora, and she was 63 years old that summer, which means she had been watching peach harvests come and go since before the Second World War, and she had strong and particular opinions about most things that grew in this county, and she was not a woman who needed your agreement before she acted on those opinions. She had driven 40 minutes each way to the alderman orchard that morning, loaded those boxes herself with the help of the 2 youngest alderman boys, and she had not told my grandfather where she was going or why, because she already knew what he would say, and she had already decided it was not relevant. He was a good man, and I loved him, but he was the type who required a thing to make sense before he would endorse it, and Cora did not always have time to wait for that process to complete itself. I remember my grandfather came out of the equipment shed wiping his hands on a shop rag when she pulled in, and he looked at the flatbed, and he looked at her, and he said, without raising his voice even a little, "What in the world are you going to do with 900 pounds of bruised peaches?" And she said, "Put them up." And he said, "Cora, that is not a serious answer." And she said, "It is the only one I have got." And he shook his head and went back into the equipment shed because he understood that this conversation had run its full length and that further discussion was his problem to manage, not hers. By noon, the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown. I heard later from a cousin who worked the counter there on weekdays that the figure had inflated to somewhere between 1 ton and 1.5 tons, and that there was genuine debate about whether Cora had lost a step or whether she had always been this particular kind of stubborn. The general consensus leaned toward the latter. Walt Greer, who ran the farm supply 2 blocks off the square and drove a truck that had never once been muddy on the underside despite the fact that he had farmed this county for 30 years, came by that same afternoon with a delivery of something we hadn't ordered, which I understood even at 11 to be a pretext. And he leaned against his truck door with his arms folded and watched my grandmother carry lug boxes to the summer kitchen. And he said, "Polite as you please, Mrs. Cora. I don't mean any disrespect, but you understand, a bruised peach won't set up in a jar any different than it will in a crate. You'll cook yourself to death in that kitchen and end up with 900 pounds of jam you can't lid properly." She stopped walking, set the box down on the step, looked at him for a moment the way she looked at things she was deciding how much patience to extend, and then she said, "Walt, I appreciate you stopping." And she picked the box back up and went inside. Walt stood there another moment, nodded once to me as if we shared an understanding, got in his truck, and drove out. I did not tell him I had no idea who was right. I want to be honest about that. I was 11, and I did not know. I knew my grandmother was not a reckless person, and I knew she did not spend money on things that would not come back to her, but I did not yet have the vocabulary for what she was doing or why. I knew the peaches smelled extraordinary, even bruised, especially bruised maybe. When a peach takes a hit like that, and the skin breaks and the juice meets the air, there is a concentration of sweetness that a perfect unbruised ship-to-market peach does not have, because that peach was picked 4 days before it was ready so it would survive the truck, and this peach was picked when it was ready and then hit by ice from the sky. And those are two very different peaches in ways that a price per pound does not begin to capture. I did not know how to say that at 11. I just knew that standing next to those lug boxes made you hungry in a specific and serious way. What I did not know then, and what I would not fully understand until I was a grown man, standing in that same summer kitchen with my grandmother's record book open on the work table, was that she had done this before, not once or twice. She had been buying Hale Bruised and cull fruit from 3 different orchards in this county for going on 20 years by that summer. She had a system, and she had a ledger, and she had a reason, and none of those things required Walt Greer's approval or my grandfather's endorsement or the diner's consensus to function. The summer kitchen sat off the back of the main house by about 20 feet, connected by a covered breezeway that kept the heat of the canning from running through the house in July and August, which was a practical consideration that whoever built it sometime in the late 1890s by the look of the framing had thought about carefully. It had its own wood stove and later a propane range, and it had a long wooden table that had been scrubbed so many times the grain stood up in ridges you could feel with your fingers, and it had shelves along 3 walls that by August of a good year would be lined with jars the way a library is lined with books, each one labeled in my grandmother's careful hand with the contents and the date, and sometimes a note that meant something to her and nothing to anyone else. My grandfather referred to the summer kitchen as Cora's laboratory, which was not entirely a compliment, but was not entirely wrong either. That evening, after supper, I followed her out there. She had already washed the first 2 boxes of peaches and laid them on clean towels, and she was standing at the table with her paring knife, and she talked to me while she worked in the way she had of talking, which was to say she would go long stretches without saying anything, and then say something that was worth having waited for. I asked her how she knew the aldermans would have bruised peaches to sell. She said she had called ahead, that she called ahead every year after any storm that dropped hail larger than a marble, and that most years the aldermans told her they had nothing to spare, and that every 3 or 4 years they called her back. I asked her how she knew $6 was the right price. She said she had offered 3, and they had asked 8, and 6 was the number both parties could stand. I asked her what she was going to do with 900 pounds of peaches, and she said, "Put them up," same as she'd told my grandfather. But this time she added, "and sell what we don't use." And then she looked at me directly and said, "Do you know what people will pay in January for something that tastes like June?" I said I did not. She said, "More than they ought to," and she said it the way a person says a thing they have confirmed empirically and no longer need to debate. The morning she pulled up with the first load, it was a Tuesday, late June of 1987, and I am telling you this story now because I am 47 years old, which is not so far from how old she was that summer, and I am standing in my own operation looking at a decision I have been putting off for 3 years, and I find I keep measuring it against that image of her setting a lug box down on a summer kitchen step and telling Walt Greer she appreciated him stopping. There is a thing that happens when you reach the age of a person you admired, which is that their decisions start to feel less like stories and more like instructions. I did not inherit the summer kitchen. It came down in a windstorm in 2003, and my grandfather was gone by then, and the home farm had passed to my uncle, and the timber went for lumber, and the foundation got poured over. What I did inherit, eventually and indirectly, through my aunt, who had packed it in a cardboard box with 2 of my grandmother's aprons and a set of canning rings that still had the price sticker on them from a hardware store that had itself been closed since 1991, was the record book. It was a standard composition book, the black and white marbled kind, 9¾ inches by 7½, with a cover that had been wiped down so many times it had a shine on it that had nothing to do with the original finish. The binding was still sound. Cora had taped the spine with white cloth tape at some point and written the dates on the spine in black marker, 1968 through 1994. And inside, in pencil gone soft and brown with age, she had kept her ledger. It was not a diary. Let me be clear about that. There was nothing personal in it beyond what was necessary. It was a record of transactions and outcomes. Each entry had a date, a source, a quantity, a price paid, a processing note, a yield in jars, and in the right margin, a figure for what those jars had returned, either by sale or by a valuation she made based on the going retail price at the time, because she was honest enough to account for what she used herself. The entries were terse. Terse is not even quite the word. They were minimal in the way that a tide chart is minimal, which is to say they contained exactly what was needed to reconstruct what happened, no more and nothing less. And you had to know how to read them to know what they were telling you. I am not a man who cries easily, and I will not make a claim here I cannot support. But I will tell you that sitting at my own kitchen table at midnight with that composition book open under the one light I had bothered to turn on, reading backward from 1994 toward 1968, I felt something I have felt only a handful of times in my life, which is the sensation of understanding arriving so late that it carries grief alongside it. She had been doing this for 26 years. She had bought bruised peaches and second-grade pears and cull apples and windfall plums from 9 different operations in this county over 26 years, and she had put them up in that summer kitchen, and she had sold them or traded them or given them as deliberate strategic gifts. And she had kept every number, and the numbers were not small. In 1987, the summer I was 11, the summer of the 900 pounds, the record showed a gross return of $412 on a $6 investment in fruit, with an additional notation in the right margin that said, 3 jars alderman, which meant she had sent 3 jars back to the family that had sold her the culls, which was both a thank you and a demonstration, and which any farmer worth the name would understand immediately as an investment in the next storm. I put the book down. I went to bed. I did not sleep especially well because you do not sleep especially well when you have just read 26 years of evidence that someone you loved had been quietly, consistently, precisely right about something for longer than you had been alive. The land doesn't care who believes in it. That was a thing she said. I heard her say it twice that summer, and I have thought about it most of my life, and it did not fully resolve for me until I read that ledger. I want to tell you about the entry for 1971, because that is the one I keep coming back to. It is the one that made me understand that she was not simply a frugal woman who disliked waste, which is how I had always described her when people asked me about her, the way you sometimes reduce a complicated person to an agreeable summary. The 1971 entry was for a load of hail-damaged peaches, 180 pounds from an orchard I will not name, because the family is still in this county and the detail is not mine to share, bought for no charge at all, because the owner had already written the crop off as a loss and was not tracking individual lug boxes by that point. Next to the 0 in the purchase column she had written, in parentheses, brought pie, which meant she had taken a pie as a courtesy when she went to collect, and had tracked even that as a cost against the transaction, because she was honest about her costs, and also because she understood that a pie was not a pie when it was also a business relationship. The yield that year from those 180 pounds was 63 quarts of preserved peaches and 11 half-pint jars of a peach conserve she made with lemon and ginger that I remember eating on biscuits as a child and have never tasted anything exactly like since. The return in the right margin after her valuation was $91 on a pie. I sat with that number for a long time. Then I sat with the next entry, which was dated 2 weeks later, and said, "Alderman called, second wave, 340 pounds, $2. And I understood then that the pie had worked, that the orchard that had given her 180 pounds for free because she had shown up with a pie at the right moment and asked the right question, had sent her to the alderman's, and that one introduction in a county like this one is worth more than a full-page advertisement in any paper you care to name, and she had known that, and she had accounted for it, and she had tracked it forward for 23 more years. On page 47 of the composition book, near the back, there was a line that was not part of any entry. It was written by itself, underlined once, with a question mark after it, in the way that she underlined things she had not yet finished thinking about. It said, "Second pressing, what remains in the skins." I stared at that line for a while. I turned the page looking for a resolution and found none. It appeared to be a thought she had at some point between entries and written down before it escaped her, and whatever she intended by it, she had never written the answer. I am 63 years old, and I have spent a portion of the last 2 years trying to understand what she meant, because I am the sort of person who does not leave an underlined question unanswered if he has the means to answer it, and because I think I know, and because what I think I know changes the shape of something I am planning on this property. And if I am right, her question was the most practical thing she ever wrote down. I put the book in my coat pocket, and I want to be honest, I kept it there for 6 weeks before I did anything about it. I would take it out at the kitchen table and open it to page 47 and read that line and then close it again because I was not ready, or I told myself I was not ready, which is sometimes the same thing and sometimes is not. My wife asked me once what I was reading, and I said Cora's book, and she said, "The one about the peaches?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "How many acres are we talking about?" And I said, "Not acres, this time. Trees." And she looked at me and waited to see if I was going to say anything else, and I did not, and she went back to whatever she was doing, because she has been married to me for 31 years, and she understands that some things need another 6 weeks. The question Cora had written was, in the way of all the best questions, a question about whether the obvious reading of a thing was the complete reading. A bruised peach is a loss. That is the obvious reading. A bruised peach is, in fact, under certain careful conditions, something closer to an opportunity if you are willing to do the work and you understand what is still living in the damaged skin. She had understood that. She had built 26 years of returns on that understanding. But what she had written on page 47 suggested she had started to wonder, near the end of her active years in that summer kitchen, whether she had been extracting everything available, or whether there was a stage of the process she had not yet investigated. There is an old man, not so much older than me, who runs a small preserving operation about 40 miles from here, out of a building that used to be a creamery. He has been doing it for over 30 years. He does not advertise. He is not on the internet in any form I have been able to find. His name was given to me by the woman who runs the bulk food section of a cooperative grocery about 60 miles in the other direction, who told me she had been buying from him since 1989 and that he was a particular and exact person, and that I should call before I came, and should not stay long unless he invited me too. I took all of that advice. I drove out there on a Wednesday morning in October of 2 years ago, which was not a Tuesday but was close enough, with the composition book on the seat beside me, and the sky the color of old tin, and the low fog sitting in the draws, the way it does when the soil is still warm and the air above it has turned. He met me in the creamery doorway. He was a compact man with hands that told you everything you needed to know about how he had spent his time, and he did not waste a minute on small talk, which I respected immediately because I am not good at small talk and have never pretended otherwise. I told him what I was trying to understand. He listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it should be. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Come in and look at something." He walked me to a section of his operation I would not describe in detail because it is his, not mine. But I will tell you that what I saw there answered Cora's question so fully and with such mechanical simplicity that I stood there for a while not saying anything, because sometimes the right answer makes you angry at how obvious it is, and sometimes it makes you quiet, and I was quiet. The process he showed me was not a secret. It was not patented or proprietary. It was a method that had been in use in various forms in this region for many decades and had been largely abandoned in favor of approaches that were faster and more consistent at the cost of something that did not show up in the yield numbers, but showed up on the tongue. He showed me the numbers anyway. I looked at them. The second pressing, what remains in the skins, was not a poetic line. It was a technical question about extraction, and the answer was that what remains is not nothing, and that what remains, handled correctly, without heat and without hurry, produces something that the first pressing does not and cannot, because the first pressing is designed for efficiency, and the second is designed for truth. He did not say that. I am saying it. What he said, after I had looked at the figures and the samples and the shelf of jars that represented 30-some years of working the same question from a different angle, was one word. He looked at the composition book, which I had opened to page 47, and he read the line, and he was quiet for a moment in the particular way of a person who is doing arithmetic in his head, and then he said, "Substantial." That was the whole of it, not "you're on to something," or "interesting theory," or "I'm not sure that's how it works." Just substantial. And he handed the book back to me, and we walked to the door, and he shook my hand, and I drove home. I am not going to tell you the full plan yet, because it is not fully formed, and because I was raised to believe that a half-built thing deserves the same privacy as a half-formed thought, and because I know what happens when you describe something that isn't finished yet to people who need it to make sense right now. You get Walt Greer leaning on his truck, with his arms folded and his mind already made up. I have no animosity toward Walt Greer. He was a practical man, and he said what he saw, and he was not cruel about it. He was just certain, and certainty is a thing I have grown progressively more suspicious of as I have gotten older, because in my experience, the people who are most certain are the ones who have stopped asking what remains. What I can tell you is what I did the spring following my visit to the creamery man, which was to plant 41 peach trees on the south-facing slope behind my barn. Not the variety you would plant if you were selling to a packing house, not the variety that ships clean and looks uniform in a crate and ripens on a predictable schedule that accommodates a truck route. A variety that was common in this county before the war and has since become what the Extension Office calls a heritage cultivar, and what I call a peach that tastes like a peach. Bred back when the question was not how does it travel, but how does it taste, and the answer was supposed to be overwhelming, and it was. They are 3 years old now and not yet fully bearing, but this past summer 4 of the oldest trees set a partial crop, and the fruit was what I expected, which is to say, it was not what a person who has only eaten a shipped peach would expect at all. My neighbor, a man who runs a row crop operation on the ground to my west, and who is not unkind but who has a predictable opinion about any decision that does not optimize for yield per acre, came by in July to return a post driver he had borrowed and looked at those 4 trees and looked at the fruit and looked at me and said, "You're not selling those to anyone who will pay real money." And I told him I was not planning to sell the fruit. I was planning to put it up. And he said, "That's a lot of work for jelly." And I said, "It's not jelly." And he said, "What is it then?" And I told him I was still working that out, which is the truest thing I have said to him in the 6 years we have been neighbors. He nodded, the way you nod at a person who is being patient in a way you do not quite understand, and he put the post driver by the barn and drove out. The first small pressing I did in August, just from those 4 trees, from the fruit that had been knocked and softened by a wind event on the 14th, because the storms still come whether you have planted for them or not. And if you have planted the right things in the right place, you learn to receive them differently. The first pressing came to 11 quarts and 4 pints. I followed the process the creamery man had shown me without shortcutting the time it required, and what I ended up with was not the bright, high acidic preserve you get from a fast-processed peach. It was something lower and denser and more complicated in flavor, with a depth of sweetness that arrives after the first impression rather than during it, the way a good piece of music continues after the last note. I sent 1 jar to the creamery man with a note. He sent back a postcard. The postcard had 2 words on it. Close enough. For that man, from what the bulk foods woman had told me, 2 words constituted an endorsement. I left 3 jars at the end of the lane with a handwritten card and a price that I will tell you was not cheap and was not meant to be, because I was testing something, and what I was testing was whether what Cora had understood in 1987 was still true, which is that people will pay in January for something that tastes like June. It was August, not January, but the principle translates in any direction. The 3 jars were gone by the following morning. By the morning after that, I had a note in the mailbox asking if there were more. By the end of the following week, I had 6 separate inquiries, 4 of them from people I had never met, which in a county this size tells you something is moving through the conversation on its own momentum. My neighbor came by again in late September, same post-driver situation in reverse, me borrowing it this time. He walked past the barn and looked at those trees, which were stripped now and going to dormancy, and he looked at the empty space where the lugs had been stacked, and he said, "You sell all of them." I said, "All I had." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Huh." Which, in the language of a man like that, in a county like this, is essentially a standing ovation. He picked up the post driver and went home. I went back to the composition book that night. I had not looked at it since October of the prior year. I opened it to page 47 and read the line again, second pressing, "What remains in the skins." And I thought about the fact that she had written it sometime in the late 1980s or early 1990s, near the end of her active years in the summer kitchen, and she had not had the years left to follow it forward. And she had left it as a question, because it was a question, and because the honest thing to do with a question you cannot finish is to write it down and leave it where the right person might eventually find it. That is what she did. That is what I found. The field doesn't care who believes in it. That is what she said. And I would add only this: neither does the jar. A jar does not care whether Walt Greer endorsed the process or whether the extension office had a category for it or whether the diner had a consensus. A jar either has something in it worth opening or it does not, and you know the answer the moment you pull the lid. Next spring I am planting 24 more trees. I am in conversation with 2 other growers in this county about their cull fruit, specifically the hail-damaged and wind-fallen stone fruit that they are currently writing off as a loss, which it is for them, because they do not have the time or the setup to do what I am planning to do with it. I have been quoted a price on a small creamery-style extraction setup used from a dairy operation that closed in 2019, and the price is not comfortable, but it is not impossible. And I have run the numbers backward from what those 3 jars at the end of my lane returned per ounce. And the arithmetic is something Cora would have recognized. She would have written it in the right margin of her ledger in pencil, gone brown with time, and she would have underlined it once, not because she needed to remember it, but because it was true, and she believed true things deserved that much at least. I have been farming this ground in one form or another for 34 years. I have made decisions that worked out and decisions that did not, and I have found that the ones that worked out almost always had something in common, which is that someone older and more patient than me had thought about the same problem from a longer angle and left some evidence behind and I had eventually been slow enough and quiet enough to find it. You cannot farm what you've already spent. That is the other thing she said, the one I heard only once, on a morning when my grandfather was discussing the cost of a piece of equipment, and she said it from the doorway of the summer kitchen without looking up from what she was doing, and my grandfather did not respond, and neither did I. But I have thought about it in the context of money and time and attention and patience and all of the other spendable things, and I believe it is true in every register you care to apply it to. 41 trees on a south-facing slope. 26 years of a ledger in a marbled composition book. One word from a man who has worked the same question for 30 years. One underlined line on page 47 that took me 2 years and 40 miles of October, driving to decode. And 3 jars gone from a fence post by morning, which is not a market study or a pilot program or a proof of concept in any language the Extension Office uses, but which is, in the language I was raised in, all the confirmation a person ought to need. If you have got your own hail-bruised thing sitting in a lug box at the end of the lane, something cheap and questioned that you have been looking at sideways for a season or two, I would genuinely like to hear about it in the comments below. Not because I have answers, but because I have found that the people who are working the same kind of question from different ground tend to know things I do not, and I am 63 years old and still interested in what I do not know. Subscribe if this meant something to you. We move slow on this channel, but we get there.